kindred friends, and welcome to the Radical Emergence podcast, where we're having conversations at the edge of transformation. We are your hosts. I'm Dr. Jen Pierre-Rich, and with me is my friend, co-host, and co-collaborator, Dr. Sally Adnams Jones. Please check out our bios in the show notes where you'll find links to our work, websites, and can find ways to connect with us. If you're not already following, hit that subscribe button, ring that bell, and join our mailing list so you can stay up to date on new episodes as they drop.
Hello, everybody. Sally here. This exciting project consists of about 26 episodes in all, dedicated to better defining and understanding transformation on all its levels of reality. That's personal, social, as well as ecological. We're going to ask, what is transformation? Why bother? Why do we need it? And what does it feel like or look like? We'll also ask, can we induce it or perhaps accidentally block it? These are really important questions for growth.
We draw not only on our hard-won life experience, we are also transdisciplinarians. So what the heck is that? Well, it means we want to understand transformation from as many lenses as possible, including formal academic disciplines and discourses, art, media, and popular culture. Importantly, we draw from our living experience.
So we are experts, so to speak, but mostly in just one small but highly critical area, our own suffering, and the medicines that we've both used to transform our own lives. So to this end, we've also added decades of committed practices, as well as formal degrees, including specific in-depth studies in the mechanisms of transformation, because we needed to understand this healing journey for ourselves.
Does this entitle us to help others? You bet. Absolutely. Because it is by sharing our stories, knowledge, and direct experience that we offer sane, sober, practical tools for living on the ground of life. So welcome. Strap in, hang on, and enjoy the ride as we deep dive into a universe of transformation.
We're delighted to share this topic with you today, the all-important topic of transformation. So just to start off this conversation, this topic has a long history, and the first people to wake up to trying to define what transformation is were those folks in the East, in India and China, and places where people were exploring enlightenment. So as you can tell, that's a different name from transformation. So what I'd like to start off with today is just drop into our shared space here the concept of semantics, which is the way words are used differently in different places and are nuanced, but suggest the same process. So about 3,000 years ago, folks were meditating in certain parts of the world and were noticing that they were changing radically, which is pretty awesome because they started putting words to this process. And they came up with words like realization, liberation, enlightenment, freedom. So these are powerful words that suggest that there's been some kind of development internally that changed the whole perception for that human of what life means, what it feels like, and how they interact with reality. So now we're going to fast forward a bit to about 100 years ago, when therapy developed in the West, and education as well as a classical discipline. Both of these fields, education and psychology in the West, started looking at this process as well. And they started using different words to describe this process of becoming more of our potential, more functional, more integrated. They started using words like actualization, individuation, empowerment, and they started mapping what actually happens. And they actually came up with stages of development. They started using words like maturation. One of the words, integration, kind of crossed the Atlantic and is used with both the East and the West. So this is interesting. Humans have been trying to understand this word. You know, it was used biblically, transfiguration. It's shown up in all the great books as a process of, some people call it transcendence, but that kind of implies an upward movement. Some people now are balancing that with descending into the body as a process of grounding and waking up. So there seems to be this axis of opening up the body to more and more capacity. Some people of India, for example, map that with chakras and how there's a process of enlightenment through opening up various centers of the body. And in the West, psychology kind of took over that practice of trying to understand what's going on. And initially, psychologists only looked at pathology, which is kind of curious. The health practices always try and look at fixing what's broken. Whereas in the East, they were looking at something beyond what's broken. So let's just take a quick look at this. This is really important. Our early understandings here in the West consider growth as a movement from dysfunction to function, good function, so that we're more integrated in society, we're relating better, we're happier. But in the East, they were looking at a movement from an already healthy human towards something more that was beyond what we consider normal well-being. So this is an important distinction, because then what happened is positive psychologists started realizing, oh, it's not just about moving from unhealth to health. It's also about moving beyond what we consider normal everyday consciousness to something much greater that actually takes some effort and practice. So it's like the unmet potential that we can bring forward through certain practices. So this is so interesting. Now we integrate both of these perspectives from East and West, and we look at the whole thing from dysfunction to function to absolute optimal well-being. So we look at the spectrum, and there's a movement in our consciousness as we transform. And there's all these words that mean the same thing that have come from different parts of the world and pretty much have been hijacked, a couple of them in each discipline, but they're looking at the same thing, at optimization of the human as an integrated being so that they can relate more functionally to reality. So that's what we're looking at. And we're going to adopt the word transformation for that process, but we're not going to limit it to one-dimensional improvement. So what I'm going to say before I hand this back to you, Jen, is what isn't transformation? And I'm going to say, for a start, it's not improving your IQ. It's definitely not thinking you're smarter and smarter. It's not about improving your information base so that you can sound smart. It's not conceptual. It's not a new set of physical skills that you can go out and market. It's not like a positive shift in your memory. It's not a positive shift in the ways we perceive intelligence as just limited to being smart. It's not conceptual. So what is it then? We're going to suggest on this podcast that it's a holographic, three-dimensional shift in the structures of your consciousness. And it can show up in all those ways, but it's not limited to that. It's much more multidimensional. And there are metrics that indicate when it's happening to you. So despite the fact that it's often precipitated by a crisis, it ends up being a three-dimensional improvement in your entire well-being. And over the next episodes, we're going to discuss metrics. So metrics isn't the topic for today. But what I'd just like to finish up with before I hand it back to you, Jen, is that some people have remarked that it's a loss. It's not a gain. So I want to just share that with you, because there's this concept of it's movement to emptiness in the East and a concept that it's a movement to fullness in the West. And we're going to say it's both at the same time. So here's a quote from Adiyashanti. I quite like his work. And he says, "Enlightenment is a destructive process. It has nothing to do with becoming better or being happier. Enlightenment is the crumbling away of untruth. It's seeing through the facade of pretense. It's the complete eradication of everything we imagined to be true." So just to suggest, Adiyashanti comes from a spiritual practice of Eastern enlightenment. So he uses the word enlightenment. And he says it's a process of cutting away illusion, which is fascinating. And in the West, we believe in cutting away dysfunction. So these are two ways of viewing transformation. Arose in the East a long time ago. They have their way, their practices, their processes. In the West, education and psychology have developed processes. They call it learning. They call it maturation, development. So I'm tossing all this into the pot as an opening statement for how we look at this complex, amazing process of being able to relate more and more functionally with more and more capacity, not only to ourselves, but to others and to reality itself. And I'd love to hear from you, Jen, how you would define this incredible process.
Well, I just loved every minute of that. I loved the outlining of our quest for transformation. There seems to have been within the human from the beginning a desire to change and transform and understand that change and transformation. So what is transformation? And as we speak about on this podcast, it really depends on how you look at it. When I was writing my dissertation for a PhD, I explored this and I found it really helpful to view it from three different lenses, which are lenses that we've adopted in this podcast. So that's the personal, the social, and the ecological. And we can add to that the transformations in the universe. Everything that we know and experience about reality started with violent transformations. The Big Bang, meteors hitting the earth, ice ages, rain for thousands of years, extinction events. Our life as we know it, the reality as we experience it, all arose through extreme destruction. And without going too far into that topic of universal transformation, it's really important to recognize that transformation is a constant in the universe. And on a smaller scale, we are experiencing that same tumultuous transformation in our own lives. Many of us can relate to that pattern of destruction and emergence. Many of us have experienced breakdowns and breakthroughs. There seems to be something really intrinsic about life that leans towards radical emergence. Something really important is unfolding. So personal transformation can include all kinds of experiences like becoming more fit, becoming a vegetarian, making dietary changes. Maybe you change a job or you go back to school. Personal transformation can be things like dark nights of the soul and transformative experiences like illness and death. As Sally always says, we are transformative beings and we live in a field of transformation. So how that transformation shows up for each of us is going to happen in endless different ways. On a sociocultural level, and that means our families and communities and ways of participating in the world, we are products of transformation from vastly different ways of being. And what I mean by that is our pre-modern brothers and sisters were really different than our modern kinfolk, right? Who can be vastly different social and cultural beings than our postmodern kinfolk. And beyond that, we have metamodernists, which is a totally different way of being in society and creating culture. Indigenous folks are socialized very differently than those of us who are enculturated in the dominant white Western frame. How transformation is viewed is very different between Indigenous folks and non-Indigenous folks. In our Western society, transformation is often viewed as a rational, linear thing that can be quantified, measured, predicted. But in Indigenous cultures, transformation is viewed as a natural part of the great wheel of life, in which all beings are interconnected. And it's a non-linear participatory phenomenon that we're all engaged with. And if you notice, that really matches Sally's notion that I spoke to earlier, that we're fields of transformation that are being informed by transformation and also informing transformation at the same time. And on an ecological level, so we've looked at the personal, we've looked at the sociocultural, and now we turn our lens towards the ecological. And we only need to look outside our window to appreciate and admire the transformative impulse of nature. Seasons change, animals adapt to those changing seasons, weather patterns change and transform, sometimes radically in a single day. I was in Hawaii recently and I was in awe of the weather changes, how that can go from a sunny sky to suddenly a gentle, kind rain to a deep, heavy rain. And then within minutes, a rainbow will appear and sometimes a double rainbow. But when you're in that downpour, it's hard to imagine a rainbow, much less a double rainbow. But it appears quite magically. And our animal kinfolk are adapting to rapidly changing conditions of weather as well, of growth. More and more of their habitats are being stripped away. And animals are fields of transformation, just like humans. I live in the suburbs of Atlanta, and we have a large population of deer that are all around because there are so many housing developments that are displacing their natural habitats and they have nowhere to go. So they adapt and they eat the flowers and the plants of all the suburbanites who get mad. And then, the suburbanites put up nets around their expensive flowers to keep the deer out, which then trap snakes and other animals who are just trying to go about their business. So nature is really transformative, and we are nature transforming nature in endless ways. So that's kind of a quick and dirty view of how I view transformation from different frames. And as we look at it from these different lenses, what comes into view is that we're all participating with it as and within fields of transformation that are really ancient and have been emerging through times of great destruction. I love Brian Swim. He is a professor at my alma mater. He's a cosmologist. And he says, I love this quote. He says, when you look at the moon, you are absorbing the moon just as the ocean absorbs minerals. Your particles are new in the sense that they have absorbed something from the photons and entered into a new state of being. This means that when you stand in the presence of the moon, you become a new creation. The photons' interactions have entered into the quantum state of your entire ensemble. And you are, through these interactions, a moon person. It's not something you have, an image or an object, so much it is something you become. There is no separate self of having this image. Rather, your totality is permeated with the moon's presence. And in this totality, in reflecting upon and within itself, exists a new awareness, the awareness of the moon. You are the self, you are the moon. That is what cosmic sensitivity means for the human. And so I feel that is what it is with all things. We absorb and become the world we see as fields of transformation. And ultimately, there is no separation between us. I'm here looking at you, Sally, across the miles through this computer, and I become a Sally Jen, and you become a Jen Sally. And isn't it beautiful the way we transform together?
Yeah, so beautifully said, Jen. I absolutely love this concept that we're a field of change, that change is a ubiquitous phenomenon. So part of how the East sees us waking up is to notice that we're all connected and interrelated, and the illusion of being a separate self has to go. So that's part of the movement of transformation, is opening up to more and more of reality and noticing that it's a system, that we're all interdependent, and that my transformation affects you and the whole world. So that's why it's so critical. So we're highlighting here that transformation is a movement in two directions at once. It's a construction of new ways of being and a destruction of the old dysfunctional ways of being. There's two arrows going on, at least two, probably hundreds, that we haven't learned to articulate yet. But there's what we call arose, which is a construction project of evolution, of a movement from single cells to multiple cells, to mammalian life form, to you and me right here, right now, as evidence that this life process of transformation is a movement in time to more and more complexity, more and more sophistication, and hopefully more and more awareness. So we're sitting here right now, comprised of oxygen, hydrogen, carbon, chlorine, iron, a bunch of stuff that came out of the stars. And yet we have the capacity to be self-aware. So evolution itself is this process of moving towards more and more capacity and awareness. And we're part of that. And you said that beautifully, Jen, that every living thing is part of that, not just us. If we imagine we're the center of the universe and we're solid, fixed identities, that's part of the illusion that the East suggests we have to drop. And If we're fixated on that identity, we're going to suffer. So things happen in our life, often suffering, often trauma, often loss, often grief, that will bring us to our knees until we notice that we're connected and that we're here to take care of each other. So what I'd like to suggest in this part of our wonderful discussion is that this process is binary. There's suffering and pain, but there's also joy and bliss. And they coexist as you transform. So transformation is not a movement away from pain. It's just a movement away from suffering, which is the filter we bring to the pain. So pain stays, it's here forever. It's part of being sentient. Otherwise, you'd have to be numb, which is not transformation. It's a movement towards more and more sensitivity and awareness. So as we transform, there might even be more pain because we're aware of suffering. We now have this capacity to empathize and have an imagination of what the other is going through. On the other hand, there's this movement towards more and more pleasure. So this is interesting. And the Hindus noticed this millennia ago, thousands of years ago, that as we transform, what gives us pleasure changes. So we can move from simple pleasures like as we're kids, playing and eating and expressing and moving towards a different kind of pleasure. As we hit puberty, we become aware of the pleasures of the sexual body and of interrelating with the other gender. And as we find a partner, we move into adulthood and the pleasures become the pleasure of procreation and family building and becoming more aware of our personal unique skills and developing those. And as we mature through life, the pleasures change. We actually move into a simplicity of pleasure. The less and less that we experience, the more pleasure we get. So there's a simplification as well as a complexity until we become supremely pleasured by serving each other and working for the whole, not just for our ego or our body or our family or our nation, but for evolution herself, for the whole planet, for the system. That gives us intense pleasure. So there's always the two things. And I would suggest that it's intensity itself that changes us. So it doesn't matter if it's pain or pleasure, ultimately. It's when something is so phenomenal, whether that's an ecstatic state, the ecstasy that can drop in on our consciousness as we experience states that are transformative, or if there's intense pain and suffering because we've become dysfunctional with our context. And there's something to learn here. So as we're going around life, buying groceries, cleaning our house, we may be experiencing wake-up calls, but they usually come in the form of an intense experience, which alters our consciousness forever. So change is ubiquitous, and we can go through life changing hardly at all, or we can experience life-changing events, even including ecstatic states that wake us up, or intense pain and suffering, as you and I, Jen, described in our first episode of our calls were through both pain and pleasure. So it's a creative process of capacity building, and eros, the capacity to build more, and entropy, to lose more, happen together in the body. And this is the creative process. And I've got a quote here from Maxine Green, who I love. She's a specialist in creativity. She says, transformation is actually through the process of affecting creativity within the self and within the world. So this is her words. It's actually through the process of affecting transformations that the human self is created and recreated over and over again. More and more effective iterations of ourself until it's all over. So before I give this conversation back to you, Jen, I'd love to tell a little story of how I experienced this. It was a heightened experience. So as I've described in episode 1, I've had lots of pain and learning lessons. I've needed them to grow up and wake up. But you also have experiences in your life that just drop in from nowhere and your life is altered forever. And they weren't painful. So I'm going to share a story with you and the listeners about the time I went to visit my sister in China. She was a teacher there, and we had this beautiful occasion to live in this big city of Beijing, which is highly dense, 22 million folks living in high-rise buildings. But each group of buildings is built around a green space. And the folks come down out of the developments and they gather in the parks to meditate. It was so amazing for me to see a whole population of people who believe in meditation as transformative. So there were people who were doing ballroom dancing. There were Tai Chi practitioners, Qigong practitioners. There were people painting with water on the sidewalk and watching it evaporate as a meditation on impermanence. All these folks had their own unique meditative practices. It was stunning for me to see this as a believer in transformation, that whole cities were practicing in public, in a green space, shared space. It was gorgeous. My sister and I were sitting on a bench watching this in our white, Western, removed, cool fashion. We were observing like scientists. And of course, that's not the way to engage with transformation. It's participatory, it's engaged. I was watching a fellow who had a crowd around him, and he had 2 sets of bricks. He was standing on one pair of bricks, and he would invite participants to step on the other pair of bricks. And he would engage them only from the wrist to the elbow, so they were crossed arms with the opponent. And the only other instruction was to look the other person in the eye and not drop the gaze. So the focus was particular. It was on the other. And he would go with them, and eventually he would knock them off their brick and they would step back. And so they had lost concentration. They hadn't grounded. Something had overwhelmed them. They'd been too rigid. So this was a Taoist master. He was teaching Taoism through movement. He turned and he singled me out. I was the only blonde person in the whole park. And he, in Mandarin, said, "You, come here." I don't have any Mandarin. I'm an introvert. And so I declined. In my usual Western way, I didn't want to step up and be seen and heard. And so I declined. And he called me again and he said, "You, come here." And it was clear he didn't even mean my sister. He meant me. So my sister pushed me forward. I'll never forget this. I had to walk through this crowd, step onto the bricks, and I'm going to make a public spectacle of myself. Here we go. I'll just do it. So what? So he indicated in Mandarin, because I don't have that language, look me in the eye, and it's only from here to here. Let's engage. Let's go. So I did. And I started learning, immediately learning what he needed from me, which was to drop into my hara at the belly, slightly bend my knees, ground myself on those bricks, feel my center of gravity, feel that as he pushed against me, I had to become flexible, feel that I could have the right to push back and that he would be flexible, and off we went. And we fell into a zone. It was that zone that changed my life forever. I got the lesson. It was a Taoist lesson of how to flow like a river, how to be utterly present, how to be focused on the other and not the self, but also have this generalized awareness that was like a field that you become utterly present to, that you open your heart and become fully embodied as you engage with life. And then you realize there's no winner and loser here. This is a dance. This is a pairing. This is a moving beyond the self to include the other in an equal force of give and take, of receiving and giving. It's a dance. Life is a dance with the other all the time and with the field. So what happened was the master realized she's got the lesson. There's going to be no overcoming. There's going to be no loss. There's no winner. There's no loser. He stepped back off his bricks and he bowed to me. And that moment changed my life, because what that indicated was mastery was of the self. That's to me what transformation is, mastery of the being and letting the being determine the doing. So what was amazing about that lesson is there was no language. The transmission occurred through an experience. And this was the deepest kind of learning that has ever occurred for me, despite PhD in this. I can't explain that. I can't explain to him, and it wasn't necessary, that I was deeply traumatized at the time. I'd left my 30-year marriage. I was devastated. I had no idea where my life was going. I was completely lost. And he found me in a park and gave me a lesson, and he changed my life. So Jen, I'm sure you have rich stories. I know you do, and I can't wait to hear yours.
Well, I mean, what a beautiful story about how we are dancing in the field of transformation, and that when we're sensitive to that, opportunities arise, experiences arise, transformative experiences arise up through the field of transformation. And the more open and receptive we are, the more we invite those opportunities into our life. I was thinking about transformation and how I wanted to package transformation. And you know, the standard bearer of transformation are butterflies. And we feel like they've gotten their time in the transformative sun. Everybody knows about metamorphosis and transformation of butterflies. So I'm really fascinated by snapping turtles. And I came across this amazing article online from Birdsong Landscapes, and we're going to put the link to this in the show notes. And the article was about common snapping turtles, many of which right now are hibernating in the Northern Hemisphere. So hibernation is a wonderful example of transformation. Many animals use hibernation to conserve energy through the harsh winter. They bury themselves deep in the mud or at the bottom of an ice-covered pond until the warmer weather comes in the springtime. But what makes this so radical and that I didn't know is that they don't take a breath for up to 6 months. They can be underground and not breathe for up to 6 months. And they limit their physical activity, but they do this with a wild type of transformation where they produce concentrations of positive ions made of magnesium, calcium, and potassium that offset the effects of the blood acidity that is caused by the lack of oxygen. They also can, during this time of not breathing, they can extend their arms and their legs and their neck in order to absorb oxygen through their skin. And the oxygen, of course, is being created by the aquatic plants and the algae growing in the waters where they are, which is a byproduct of photosynthesis, which is another example of transformation that we humans depend on for our survival. So the universe is constantly creating itself out of itself in these recursive flows of transformation. And turtles, like tardigrades or water bears, and cockroaches have been around for over 200 million years. They are real survivors. Turtles haven't changed much at all in 200 million years. They were around when dinosaurs were around. And so these are beings that have moved with transformation and have been able to adapt to the changing conditions. So, of course, I'm thinking about snapping turtles, and it makes me wonder how we can be more adaptable and transformative, like turtles and tardigrades and cockroaches. How can I trust that if I'm experiencing the darkness of seasonal depression, which is something that I struggle with, that it's okay for me to go deep underground, metaphorically? And trust that process of transformation in a way that knows that I'm going to survive, and not only survive, but I'm going to come up from deep below the surface of that depression and be able to breathe again in a new way with a different type of awareness, that I'm going to be transformed by that experience. How do I lean into that? And I believe that nature is always teaching us about transformation, and that when we pay attention to our animal kinfolk teachers, we can learn to move with transformation rather than against it. No turtle ever survived going against the flow of life. And I think that is true for us as well. I'd like to give a story quickly about a moment of transformation that I experienced. And it was exactly like you had, Sally. It was a transmission through experience, not through words. I live in a disabled body, so things that require physical activity are harder for me. And I got a master's degree in transpersonal ecopsychology from Naropa University. And as part of graduating in that program, you have to do a 3-day wilderness solo. Some people fasted. I did a light fasting through it, just liquids. And but so I had done all of this work to prepare for this solo, which physically for me was very difficult. I have these rods in my spine that hold me up, that I need because I have so much radiation damage in my spine. So I had just a couple years before had a major reconstructive surgery to my spine with new rods. So here I am going out on this wilderness solo, and I'm just crossed the threshold to say goodbye to my peer group and to my instructors. I'm going out alone into the wilderness, and I'm come up to a rushing stream, and it has a plank across it that somebody has placed so you can get to the other side. And as I stepped my first foot down on that plank, I heard snap in my back, and I knew I had broke a rod in my back. And, you know, all the things go through my mind. First, tremendous pain, because I can feel it as I try to move my legs forward to keep going. And then I think, do I stop? Do I go forward? Do I go back and say, I can't do this? You know, I've had this major incident, and, you know, I'm pretty tough, pretty brave. So I'm like, no, I'm going to go forward. And I'm not going to go back. I worked so hard to get here. My family's worked so hard for me to be here. I'm going to do this. So I hobbled myself to the site that I had prepared earlier in the day. And I had a tent there. And I was so lucky and blessed to be in Colorado amongst the aspen trees. And if you've ever been around aspen trees, they are some of the most friendly, loving trees you've ever experienced. And immediately I felt welcomed into their community, probably the same way you felt when that master brought you into that space. I was invited into this healing community with the trees immediately and held for 3 days in the most profound, I get teary, transformative experience of my life, of being held while in tremendous pain, physical pain from being, poked in the back by this broken rod, but yet totally in an alternate dimension of reality with this healing community of trees. And I learned from that experience what it is to enter into a transformative experience, into a painful experience, and come out the other side profoundly transformed. And not a word was spoken. Not a word spoken, just like in your story, Sally. And isn't it beautiful the way we are invited into these fields of transformation? And if we're brave enough to continue to walk and go forward into that pain, that something profoundly beautiful can arise out of that. So thank you for listening.
Yeah, Jen, so amazing how you shared that sometimes the biggest lessons come through pain and there's pleasure at the same time. So this is a pair of ducks. We're going to talk about the paradox throughout our session. So the pair of ducks is right here.
The paradox has arrived.
So just riffing off your amazing story of courage and resilience, noticing how the universe is like a massive mechanism for digestion. There's peristalsis from the universe on us all the time, massaging us to keep learning, keep growing, changing. Some of that is painful, some of that is pleasurable, and we begin to see all of these experiences as gifts. Every moment is our teacher and can help us transform depending how we manage that experience. So part of this constant change of the universe is an understanding that it sometimes is instant and sometimes it takes time. So valuing both of those experiences and understanding also that it's a movement that includes survival as well as thrival. So the lessons are at different parts of us. Often yours was survival and you turned that right into thrival, well-being in community with nature. Sometimes though, we have to notice, for example, with our animal kinfolk, that if change is too fast, they don't have the opportunity to adapt. So honoring that change takes time and that the transformation is on a cellular DNA memory level, and sometimes our animal relatives can't adapt in time, like the grizzly bear, for example. I live here in Canada, and in the Rockies we have populations of grizzly bears, and humans come into that landscape and change the landscape too fast for them to adapt. We put highways across their territories. Suddenly their 70K radius that they need as a piece of space for them to thrive is reduced to a 10-kilometer space. They can't find their partners. They're disorientated. They get hit on the highway. So honoring that each life form has its own rhythm, and coral reefs can't adapt in time for the heating of the oceans, they die. So honoring all the life forms that are aiming to survive and thrive, and that each experience requires adaptive behaviors. And we're all different, as you said, Jen, and the human itself is particularly gifted with adaptability. It's one of the gifts that we bring. Because we can learn, because we have language, where these lessons can be transmitted in many ways, through language, through books, through cultural processes, through designs of curricula. We have transformative curricula that we can teach each other. So we can put ourselves in situation to change deliberately, whereas other forms of nature don't have that. So we have to be really aware that just because we're fast and we're getting speedier and more able to digest, so it's a process of digesting the lessons from the universe. We can do that quite quickly. Some of our relatives can't. So respecting that in all ways. So when we talk about transformation, it's for humans, we can experience changes in our values, our perspectives, our structures of consciousness, and even our internal identity. But we can't expect our animal and biological context to do that in the same way. So when we only consider ourselves and our own change, we can actually be very violent as well. So we have to bring the notion of change to the whole system, and that speed of change is not helpful to some of our context, even if we're speedy. But even as technology changes and we're called to speed up our adaptability, we might find that that change is too fast for us to even digest. So we could go extinct, just like our bear friends and our turtle friends and our coral reef sculptures in the ocean, because the scale and the speed at which we can digest is kind of fixed to our biological entity. So we might find that we're becoming overwhelmed, that we can't digest fast enough. So this is part of what we need to understand as we reach this possibility of extinction ourselves. So Jen, I would love you to explore more about your understanding as we wrap up this week's offering on identifying what transformation is and how it's for the whole, not just for us.
I love that this reminder that, you know, our transformation impacts other species, and that the turtles and the cockroaches and the tardigrades might outlive us. You know, it's possible for us to extinct ourselves off this planet, and yet it goes on and continues transformation without the human experience. And that's a possibility too. So I think taking this really sensitive, subtle view of transformation, how it happens harsh and fast and also slow over time, is really important. I just want to end with a quick reading from Rilke that I think says it all for me about transformation. Want the change. Be inspired by the flame where everything shines as it disappears. The artist, when sketching, loves nothing so much as the curve of the body as it turns away. What locks itself in sameness has congealed. Is it safer to be gray and numb? What turns hard becomes rigid and is easily shattered. Pour yourself like a fountain. Flow into the knowledge that what you are seeking finishes often at the start, and with ending begins.
So beautiful, Jen. I can't wait to really open up this topic over the next year. I can't think of a deeper privilege, and I can't imagine a better partner than you, Jen, and the way the universe put us together on the interwebs. We found each other, the synchronicity of that. Who on earth is such a geek that they'd go and do a PhD in transformation? And not because it's credentialism, it's because it's our passion and we wanted to understand that more. So what an opportunity. And if nothing else, I'm just delighted to have a year-long conversation with you, my dear friend.
Agreed. I think we are so lucky to have found, well, what luck probably has nothing to do with it. It seems to be written in the stars that this podcast would arise, that our friendship would arise, and that we would find each other. And I know there are others listening who are likewise really interested in transformation and who have been experiencing their own transformations. And I hope that our podcast is helpful for you as you are on your transformative journey. And I'm really interested to hear about your transformative journeys. We have a Facebook page called Radical Emergence Podcast. And if you are listening and experiencing your own transformations and have your stories of transformation, drop it on our page. We would love to hear about it and maybe include it even on the show as an example of transformation. So I just love you infinitely, to the moon and back, as a Jen Sally and a Sally Jen, as we drop these identities and are experiencing our oneness together. It's such a thrilling ride, and I'm so grateful.
So thanks for joining us. And we hope you can take away some helpful tools, perhaps some great stories, and some wisdom for your own ongoing journey.
Join us for our next episode, where we will deep dive again into a universe of transformation.